Hello and welcome to today's training, Promoting Positive Adaptation in Youth Exposed to Natural Disasters, the Harvey Resiliency and Recovery Program with Dr. Julie Kaplow, PhD and ABPP. I am Helen Heyman, Director of Programs at ADAA. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. We will first kindly ask you to mute yourselves so that we don't hear any background noise. To mute yourself, you will need to press the gray tab just below the red arrow. Kindly also switch off your webcam. The webcam tab is just below the mute tab. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat panel of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. You will also be able to access materials. If you registered and paid for continuing education credit, you will first need to provide the 4-letter CE code on the webinar evaluation form in SurveyMonkey. The link to the evaluation form in SurveyMonkey will be sent to you 48 hours after the end of the professional webinar. You can either answer the post-assessment questions at the end of this webinar by staying online. The assessment questions will appear at the very end, and at the end of the talk, a screen will come up with the questions. You will have 5 minutes to answer the questions. You can answer them and click Submit, or alternatively, you can answer them in SurveyMonkey. I would like to now introduce our expert. Dr. Julie Kaplow, PhD and ABPP, is a licensed clinical psychologist and board certified in clinical child and adolescent psychology. Dr. Kaplow holds a primary appointment as associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston and an adjunct appointment in the Department of Palliative Care at Anderson Cancer Center. Dr. Kaplow also serves as director of the Trauma and Grief Center at Texas Children's Hospital, the designated treatment and service adaptation center of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, specializing in child and adolescent trauma and bereavement. In this role, Dr. Kaplow oversees evidence-based assessment, treatment, and research with traumatized and bereaved youth and families, and develops and disseminates trauma and bereavement-informed best practices to community providers nationwide. With support from the Children's Health Fund and the GPB Foundation, Dr. Kaplow recently established a Harvey Resiliency and Recovery Program housed within the Trauma and Grief Center to provide evidence-based risk screening and interventions to children and families adversely affected by Hurricane Harvey and its aftermath. Dr. Kaplow has published widely on the topics of childhood trauma and bereavement, including invited articles and editorials focusing on age-specific manifestations of grief and trauma-related methodological issues, and developmental models of bereavement and related risk and resilience. It is a true honor and pleasure to work with this professional. I will now pass the stream along to Dr. Kaplow.
Okay, thank you so much, Helen, and thank you everyone for joining. And Helen, unless I hear differently, I'm assuming you can see my screen. But today I'm going to be talking about promoting positive adaptation in youth exposed to natural disasters, and I'm going to also talk a little bit about a new program that we established in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. I do have a few disclosures related to funding, and also one of the treatments that I'm going to be talking about today is actually coming out in book form shortly, and that's trauma and grief component therapy. And then finally, one of the assessment tools that I'll also mention is licensed through UCLA Office of Intellectual Property. So today what I plan to talk about is the role of our TAG Center here in Houston. I'm also going to talk about the significance of bereavement and grief in children and what to expect from children in the aftermath of a hurricane. We're going to talk about risk markers among hurricane-exposed youth and how to know when kids may need more help. We'll also talk about a best practice model for support and mental health service delivery post-disaster, which we've learned and gleaned from a lot of the work that was done post-Katrina. We'll also talk about an effective group-based intervention that's been used in several different disasters, and that's trauma and grief component therapy. And then I'm going to end by talking about our new Harvey Resiliency and Recovery program. So the Trauma and Grief Center at Texas Children's Hospital has 3 primary goals. And what we are really designed to do is to develop and implement and evaluate and disseminate evidence-based treatments for traumatized or grieving youth, and also provide training and best practices for traumatized or grieving youth, including trauma and bereavement-informed assessment and intervention. But in order to do these things, we really need to address 3 first steps. And the first is theory. So one of the things that we're really grappling with in the current state of the literature right now is how do we conceptualize adaptive versus maladaptive grief reactions in children. There just hasn't been a lot of research that has examined that question. And we also don't know very much about the interplay between post-traumatic stress and grief in childhood and what that looks like over time. In terms of assessment, we need to better understand how to adequately and accurately measure grief and PTSD in children of different ages and cultures, and that's something that we're actively working on. And then finally, with regard to our empirical research, our goal is really to help identify important therapeutically modifiable risk and protective factors, so those that we can either reduce or harness in therapy. I want to say a little bit about the Trauma and Grief Center and its role within the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. For those of you who aren't familiar with this network, this is comprised of about 150 sites, I think, at this point, across the United States that are dedicated to providing trauma-informed services to children. And of those 150 sites, about 20 or 25 of them are what's called Category 2 sites, and that's what our Trauma and Grief Center is. The Category 2 sites are really serve as sites that have a specific area of focus, and our area of focus is bereavement and grief. So we treat all forms of trauma, but we develop new interventions that are designed to address bereavement and grief in particular and disseminate them across the U.S. For those who aren't familiar with this website, I would highly recommend checking it out. This actually has a lot of wonderful resources for teachers, clinicians, parents, related to all forms of trauma that children may experience. And they also have a learning center where there are trainings that you can take about different types of interventions that are really designed for traumatized youth. So I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir for many of you, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, when we're talking about trauma, we're really talking about an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm the person's capacity to cope. And there can be different types of traumas. We know that there are acute traumas, such as car accidents or disasters or a death or a terrorist act. And we also know that there are chronic traumas that can go on for much longer periods of time, including domestic violence, child abuse, chronic illness, community violence. And what we also know is that many of these traumas cluster together. One of my colleagues, Dr. Christopher Lane, coined the term risk factor caravan to really better understand the fact that many of these traumas do co-occur quite frequently. So for example, if you have a child who's been sexually abused, there's a very good chance that that child was also emotionally abused. So by knowing what types of traumas cluster together, we have a better understanding of the overall picture of that child's trauma history. We also know that post-traumatic stress doesn't always appear the way that it's written in the DSM. And particularly for children, it can manifest in many different ways that are often behavioral. So we often see regressions in developmental milestones or skills, fear and worry about the safety of other people, anxiety related to future possible trauma, increased activity levels, decreased concentration and attention, increased irritability, changes in sleep or appetite, withdrawal or social withdrawal, angry outbursts, aggression, aches and pains, decline in grades, problems with peers, substance abuse, dangerous behaviors, or unhealthy sexual behaviors, particularly in adolescence. And what we also know is that many of these things can be misdiagnosed. So for example, when we see increased activity levels and decreased concentration and attention, oftentimes what we have is a misdiagnosis of ADHD. Certainly PTSD and ADHD can co-occur, but what we often find is that those children have been misdiagnosed early on because there was not really a thorough assessment of potential trauma. When we're talking about bereavement and grief, these two terms often do get confused in the literature. So when we talk about bereavement, we're really referring to the experience of deprivation or loss by death. And when we talk about grief, it's really the psychological or behavioral response arising from bereavement. So trauma is to PTSD as bereavement is to grief. And why are we focusing on bereavement in particular? We know that bereavement is the most frequently reported type of adversity in clinic-referred youth. And we also know that it's the most frequently reported in the general population. So the worldwide lifetime prevalence of children bereaved by the death of one or both parents was actually 151 million in 2011. And that doesn't include bereavement due to loss of a sibling or loss of a grandparent or other caregivers. We also know that the death of a loved one is identified as the most common and the most distressing form of adversity among adults and youth in the general population. So if you survey people and ask them what was the hardest thing that's ever happened to you, the vast majority will say that it was the death of a loved one. And then finally, what we're finding in a recent study is that bereavement is the strongest predictor of poor school outcomes above and beyond any other form of trauma, and that includes sexual abuse, physical abuse, and domestic violence. So we know that this is something that we need to be paying a close attention to, and often bereavement gets overlooked as an adversity that we need to be, obviously paying a lot of attention to in order to rectify some of the negative ramifications. So why am I talking about bereavement today? When we think about how children typically react to hurricanes and their aftermath, we have found post-Katrina, and this was a study done by Jaycox et al., that the majority of youth treated for PTSD had experienced both prior traumas and losses. And actually the most common trauma, once again, was the death of a loved one. So it was death or serious injury of a loved one, with the majority being deaths. And about 70% of the sample said that they had experienced a prior death. And we also know that hurricanes and floods in and of themselves are unlikely to result in PTSD. So oftentimes it is that prior trauma or prior loss that is exacerbating those symptoms in the aftermath of a hurricane. So how do children typically react in the aftermath of hurricanes? What we often see and what we consider normative certainly in the more immediate aftermath is fear and worry regarding the safety of other people, separation anxiety, so clinging to their caregivers or teachers, worries about another hurricane or flood happening, increase in activity level, inattention, distractibility, withdrawal from others, angry outbursts or tantrums, irritability or aggression, physical complaints, particularly for those kids that don't often express how they're feeling, that can manifest as stomach aches, headaches, change in school performance, repetitive play or rumination about the event, increased sensitivity or hypervigilance in response to rain, thunder, or wind, a change in sleep patterns and behavior. So sleeping with caregivers is very common, a change in appetite, a lack of interest in things that they used to enjoy. And often with adolescents, they may have similar behaviors, but may be more prone to risky behaviors like substance use or dangerous activities. And again, in the more immediate aftermath of the hurricane, these are things that we see quite often. But then how do we know if a more thorough evaluation is needed? So if these behaviors were to continue for more than 6 weeks following the event, that's something that we would want to pay close attention to and probably refer that child for an evaluation. If those behaviors are interfering with functioning in any major life domain, including school, home, or with peers, again, for more than 6 weeks, that's something we would want to think more about in terms of an evaluation. If we see developmental regressions, extreme signs of depression, so tearful, not able to get out of bed in the morning, any gesture, of course, related to self-harm or a mention of suicidal ideation, and then possible PTSD, so re-experiencing, feeling like it's happening all over again, avoidance, not wanting to think about or talk about the hurricane or flood, negative cognitions, persistent anger or guilt, arousal and reactivity, exaggerated startle response, and in adolescence, this can also include reckless or destructive behavior. So how do we know which youth are most at risk? And there have actually been a number of studies that have been conducted that have really tried to identify what are the most potent or important risk factors following a hurricane. And what we find is that one of the most important, again, is experiencing the death of a loved one. And this actually does include pets. Injured, if they themselves were injured or if a loved one was injured during the hurricane or storm, experienced extensive damage to their home, were forced to move, separated from their caregivers at any point during the storm, belongings, clothes, or toys were destroyed, evacuated with little or no time to prepare, if they required rescue by helicopter or boat, if they were trapped or had difficulty escaping, if they were displaced from the home for a long period of time, so if they were in a shelter, history of trauma, so if they, for example, experienced Katrina and then experienced Harvey, if they were forced to move to a new school, if they lacked social support, so their close relatives were in another state, if a family member served as a rescue worker, we know that that can also contribute to greater post-traumatic stress, financial difficulties prior to or as a result of the hurricane or flood, and importantly, the threat of recurrent disasters. And this is particularly important for our Houston community, given that so many of them, this is maybe their second or third flood that they've experienced. So what is really important to note about all of these risk factors is that the findings show a dose-response relationship. So as exposure increases, emotional distress increases. So while we know that certain risk factors are more potent, so for example, the death of a loved one, we also know that as those risk factors accumulate, regardless of what they are, that poses a greater risk for kids in terms of their mental health distress. What kind of support then is needed, and for which kids and when? So I don't often compare children to rats, but in this particular situation, I think this is a really interesting experiment that does have some implications for how kids function in the aftermath of a disaster. And this was done by Pinkstep back in 1998, and what he did is he studied rat play and basically studied when rats were in a calm, continuous state and what that looked like, versus when rats were stressed and what that looked like in terms of their functioning and their psychophysiology. Their physiology. And what he did was he conducted an experiment where he had lab rats in a cage and watched their play. And so basically he monitored their play for about 4 days. And then on day 4, he introduced a single cat hair into the cage. And mind you, these are lab rats, so they've never been out of the cage before. But what happened was when he introduced that cat hair, the rat play diminished almost completely so that the rats froze and they stopped playing. And then on day 5, he removed the cat hair, thinking, of course, they would probably go back to their normal level of play. And what was really interesting about this experiment is that they never went back to baseline. So the rats continued to stay frozen. And I believe he followed these rats for up to a month, and they again, never returned to baseline. So what does this mean? And obviously, we can only extrapolate a little bit from this, but we know that we are wired to respond to danger and threats to safety. And when you think about children who are living with the cat, so those kids who are living with the perpetrator, and the perpetrator is removed from the home, that child still may be stuck in a state of alarm. And it may take a very long time to get that child back to a state where they feel like they can be calm and be in a sort of that calm, continuous state. And what we also know about that state is that that is a state that is helpful for learning. When you are in a fearful state, it is very hard to learn and acquire new information. And so when we think about what happens to kids in the aftermath of disasters, they may be stuck in more of an alarm state, especially if they've had a lot of those exposure-related risk factors. And getting them back to a calm, continuous state takes some work on the part of their caregivers and the part of their environment. So what can we do to help those kids after a disaster? What we often tell parents is that there are about 5 S's that they can remember that can be very beneficial to kids in the aftermath. So first is safety and security. What we want to do is help parents to reestablish that protective shield for the child. So oftentimes it is a rude awakening for kids to recognize that, wait a minute, I thought my parents were supposed to protect me from bad things happening, and this horrible thing happened. Now what do I do? And so parents can reassure their children by saying that the adults in their lives are taking care of things, that they are going to do their best to repair what's happened, that they're going to do their best to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But whatever they need to do to kind of reassure kids that these are adult worries and we're going to take care of them. Simple and straightforward, so using kid-friendly language and allowing the child to guide the conversation. As caregivers, we often either err on the side of not providing any information at all, because if the child's not bringing it up, we think, well, maybe let's let sleeping dogs lie and not raise any issues. But oftentimes children are thinking about and wondering about and maybe fearful of what's happening in their environment in the aftermath of a disaster. And then oftentimes as caregivers, we may also provide too much information, so too much detail. And what's often very helpful is to really allow the child to guide that conversation. So to say something like, I know things are really confusing or scary right now, but I'm here to talk to you whenever you need me, and really just opening up that door. To supervise, and we find this all the time, that kids are exposed to so much media and so much TV that is not helpful. And we know this even from being an adult. So watching CNN, you know, in the more immediate aftermath of the hurricane could be traumatizing to anybody, having to see that. So really monitoring what the child is watching and being there to supervise that. Social support, we know, is one of the most potent and important protective factors in the aftermath of a disaster. So encouraging children to have more social interactions with family, with friends, and really allowing for that is very important. And then finally, for caregivers, self-care is very crucial. So oftentimes we're so worried about our children that we forget to take care of ourselves and get the support that we need. So making sure that caregivers are doing that for themselves, just as you would if you, they talk about being on a plane and needing to put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you give it to your child. It's a similar situation here where we need to make sure that caregivers are taking care of themselves so that they can provide the best care to their children. So this is a tiered mental health service delivery model post-disaster that has been developed. Actually, it's been around for a while, but I was fortunate to have been in contact with a number of people post-Katrina who sent me this slide. So I want to acknowledge the Project Fleur de Lis folks. But what we've known for a while is that in the more immediate aftermath, it's really about immediate practical help that we need to focus on. So where can families go to get FEMA assistance or to get the resources they need or to get their feet back on the ground or to get shelter, to get food? So, those are really the most important pieces in the more immediate aftermath. We also know that intermediate resiliency education can be very helpful, and this is more of a universal type of intervention where we provide more just sort of normal coping skills and emotion regulation skills. And then finally, for the top tier, we have formal therapy either with individuals who are identified as needing a higher level of intervention or in groups. And I'm going to talk more about what those specific interventions might look like. So for example, with the more immediate interventions, we talk about psychological first aid, which is really not technically an intervention, but more of a framework where we can help people to better understand how to help others in their community, what kinds of support they can provide to them, and really resource sharing. With Skills for Psychological Recovery, this is more of that preventive intervention model where we're really delivering basic coping skills and emotion regulation skills to children or adults, but really to children who could just benefit in general from those coping skills. And this is something that has been provided in classrooms where students may have been somewhat affected by the floods but may not have had high levels of exposure. And then that would take place within, after about 3 weeks post-hurricane or post-disaster. And then after about 3 months have passed is when we really start to look for some of those signs and symptoms that children or adolescents may need a higher level of care. And so 2 of the interventions that I'll highlight today that have been used post-disaster include trauma and grief component therapy, as well as cognitive behavioral interventions for trauma in schools, or CBITS, which many of you may have heard of. So these are both group-based, classroom-based interventions that have been successful in the aftermath of disasters in reducing post-traumatic stress and related psychological distress. And then finally, for those kids that really don't belong in a group and need a higher level of care, meaning they need individual therapy and or psychiatric help, that's where we would get into more of the individual tailored trauma-informed treatments. So I just want to say a few words about Skills for Psychological Recovery for those of you who aren't familiar. This really teaches 6 main skills, and again, this is a preventive intervention model where we gather information and identify primary concerns. It helps with problem-solving skills, so how to break problems down and create an action plan, promote positive activities, so building resilience, bringing more enjoyment, managing reactions, so emotion regulation and how to identify and plan for potential triggers. It promotes helpful thinking, so helping to replace unhelpful thoughts with helpful ones. And it helps to rebuild healthy social connections, so it encourages social and community support. And so SPR can come in different forms. There is just general SPR, which is actually free. There's a free training on the NCTSN website for this. I've also been working closely with Save the Children that they have been implementing Journey of Hope, which is also a type of skill for psychological recovery type of intervention. And again, what we do with this more immediate type of preventive intervention is really focus on those emotion regulation skills. So this is just showing one of the activities that we do, which is having children draw that's supposed to represent their brain and the different emotions they have, and we'll have them color in different colors of emotions for the way that they're feeling. So for this child, scared was green, purple was nervous, blue was happy, and red was, well, it's unclear, shy, I think. But basically what we do is we try to get them to label their emotions, and this also, brings up this important lesson that kids can have many different feelings at the same time, and often kids find this to be an enjoyable activity. We also teach deep breathing as one of the emotion regulation strategies, and so helping kids to understand that when their body is relaxed, it's very hard for their mind to be stressed, and that's something that we teach them pretty early on to really help them to kind of regain their composure and help them when they are feeling stressed, particularly in the more immediate aftermath. One of the most interesting studies that I came across was a study that examined group versus individually based interventions that were provided post-Katrina. And what they found is that they did provide group sessions in the schools using CBITS, and of the 58 children enrolled in those sessions, 53 completed treatment, so they had really good adherence. And then they also compared that to individual sessions, so this was TFCBT, provided at community clinics, and of the 60 children enrolled, only 7 completed the treatment. So what does this mean? In the more immediate aftermath of a disaster, what we know is that treatment is more successful if we can meet kids where they are, so for example, in the schools, And another interesting fact from that was that not only were students experiencing symptoms related to the disaster, but many had experienced more devastating traumas and deaths prior to the disaster. So again, speaking to the need for interventions that really focus on those prior traumas or losses is very important. So speaking of that, I just want to talk a little bit about why we believe it's important to distinguish PTSD from grief when we're talking about evidence-based interventions in the aftermath of disasters. I want to say a few words about how children typically grieve. And this is very hard to define when we talk about what is typical. And again, the reason for that is because there have been very few large studies of bereaved children, and even fewer that have followed kids over time, and even fewer that have included culturally diverse samples. So if you look at the literature, what you often find is that most of the studies of grief in children have been conducted on middle-class Caucasian adolescents. So again, we really don't know how much we can generalize from those studies. We also know that grief reactions are influenced by a host of factors, including the child's developmental level, their previous life experiences, their relationship to the deceased person, their culture, their religion, their spiritual beliefs, their family, their social environment, and the cause of death. So to be able to say that this is a normal reaction versus this is an atypical or not normal reaction is very hard because we have to account for all of these different factors that may play a really important role. So in order to try to address what might be adaptive versus maladaptive, the first thing we need is a good theory that really addresses how grief might manifest in kids over time. And this is something that I've been fortunate to be working on with my colleagues at UCLA, Bob Pinus and Chris Lane. And what we've been doing is we've been testing this model of grief, and we're calling this multidimensional grief theory. But what we're finding is that kids, backing up a little bit, when you think about the adult literature, oftentimes what you find is that they will say this adult has prolonged grief disorder or doesn't, or this person has complicated grief or doesn't. And so really looking at it as in a more dichotomous way. What we're thinking, though, is that grief, at least in childhood from what we've seen, is multidimensional, meaning that kids may be high or low in different domains of grief. So for example, with regard to separation distress, that's yearning and longing for the person who died. Kids may be high or low in that domain. They may be high or low in identity distress, so feeling lost without the person, or how am I going to live my life without the person. They may also be high or low in circumstance-related distress, so being very preoccupied with the cause of death or how the person died. And we also believe and have seen through our research that there is an adaptive counterpart to each of these domains. So for example, with separation distress, I was treating a young girl who lost her mother, and she was very, really yearning and longing to have mom back, and that was very powerful for her. But at the same time, she was doing things that helped her to feel more connected to her mom. So for example, she started to take swimming lessons because that was an activity that her mom thoroughly enjoyed, and every time that this girl was in the water, she felt more connected to her mother. So that would be a more adaptive response to the challenge of missing her mom. With existential or identity distress, we hear kids say all the time, I don't know how I'm going to live my life without so-and-so, so without my dad or without my mom. But we also hear them saying, but I want to live the kind of life that my mom would have wanted me to live, or I want to do A, B, and C because I know that's what my dad would have wanted for me. So again, that's more of an adaptive response that we grow or try to harness in our treatments. And then circumstance-related distress, we see the adaptive side of this all the time, where people raise money for different causes related to how the person died. So raising money for breast cancer because someone's mother died of breast cancer. A lot of the most wonderful things in our society come from having the experience of losing a loved one to that particular cause. So we see this as something that happens quite frequently, and we often see this in kids. So I was just treating a 9-year-old who lost his dad in a plane crash. And what he said was that he wanted to grow up to be an engineer so that he could make planes that don't break anymore. And again, an adaptive response to the tragic circumstances under which his father died. So the reason we're talking about grief is because we also believe that there are different risk factors associated with trauma and loss, and those include trauma and loss reminders. So for example, with trauma reminders, what we're talking about are images, sounds, smells, people, situations that remind the child of the traumatic event. And this can include the sound of fireworks if the person died by gunshot, movies about a car accident if the person died of a car accident, feelings or physiological sensations that were happening at the time of the trauma can also be reminders later. And people who were there, people are often the most potent trauma reminders. So people who were there at the time that an accident happened or a death occurred can be trauma reminders for kids. And these are what often lead to post-traumatic stress or circumstance-related distress in the case of a death. Loss reminders are similar, but these are images, sounds, smells, people, or situations that remind the child of the absence of the person who died. So this can include being around the person's friends, their clothing, their favorite chair, and this is what often leads to grief reactions, particularly separation distress. And the reason I bring this up is because what we believe is that the way that you help to address trauma reminders and what those trigger versus how you address loss reminders and the resulting consequences of that looks different. And it looks different both in terms of assessment and intervention. Just to give you an example of this, we did some semi-structured interviews with kids when we were testing a new semi-structured interview for post-traumatic stress. And it was really designed to validate this new PTSD measure. But what we also found is that we had some really interesting and good examples of how we're differentiating trauma and loss reminders. And so this is taken from transcripts with a 17-year-old girl who witnessed the murder of her mother by her father. And this girl didn't just witness the murder, she actually tried to intervene. So this was a very, very traumatic case. So the clinician says, do you get very afraid, upset, or sad when something reminds you of what happened? And she says, oh yeah, screaming, the door slamming, firecrackers, that and seeing or hearing arguments. Whenever I hear somebody fussing or anyone arguing, especially if it's a man, I want to run and just go get a knife. It brings me right back. I get to the point where I'm so scared, I'll kill you if you make another move. I wouldn't mean to do it, it's just out of fear. They could even just be playing, but just hearing that scream, it just makes me feel like I'm back there again. The clinician says, and when these things happen, how much do they bother you? And the patient says, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd have to say 20. So if you can imagine even something as simple as hearing screaming, like on the playground outside, or hearing a door slamming and being triggered and having this occurring on a daily basis, these are what we know are trauma reminders that can immediately segue into symptoms of PTSD. And then the clinician went on to say, and have you tried to stay away from people, places, or things that remind you of what happened? The patient says, I can't go to the mall anymore. I went only one time after she died, but I couldn't go after that. There's a lot of stores and stuff that I like there, and I want to go so bad, but I can't because I don't have my mama anymore. And the clinician says, is that because the mall reminds you of what happened? And the patient says, the mall just reminds me of her in general. Through good times and bad times, we always went there together. So this is a good example of a loss reminder. This is not a trauma reminder. This is not segueing into PTSD. This is segueing into separation distress. And often the way that we address that and help with that is to find healthy ways of feeling connected to the person who died, as opposed to trauma reminders, which require more of an exposure-based type of intervention. So what does this mean? And this is taken from a chapter that we recently wrote, which you're welcome to download for free on our, I have an academia.edu website that you can download this from. But what we really are talking about here is that grief is not the equivalent of PTSD. And grief and PTSD may each contribute to different forms of suffering, but their combination makes it difficult to function. So if you can imagine the last time you felt petrified, as well as the last time you felt so sad that you couldn't stop crying, and imagining that that's happening all at the same time in the body of a child. We know how taxing that is psychologically and emotionally and physiologically. and it obviously takes a different type of treatment to be able to address both of those. PTSD, we know, can interfere with adaptive grieving, and similarly, grief can interfere with recovery from trauma. And effective treatments for both PTSD and grief really involve distinguishing between PTSD and maladaptive grief and using specific practice elements to address PTSD versus maladaptive grief. So ensuring that we have the appropriate assessment tools as well as the appropriate interventions to adequately address both. So speaking of that, I want to mention one of the treatments that I had mentioned earlier, which is trauma and grief component therapy, which is an assessment-driven, evidence-based, group-based intervention that has been used post 9/11 in the aftermath of earthquakes and hurricanes. So trauma and grief component therapy is, again, a group-based intervention that is divided into 4 modules. And the first module is group cohesion and psychoeducation, as well as basic coping skills. The second module is when we get into trauma processing. The third is when we work on grief processing. And the fourth is when we talk about resuming developmental progression and helping that child or adolescent to move forward. I want to note that Module 1 is, again, more of a universal type of preventive intervention. And so we've been using that in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey as another type of preventive intervention that can be used in classrooms and with kids who may not be experiencing high levels of PTSD, whereas the modules that come after that are really designed to address PTSD, maladaptive grief, and depression. So we have good evidence of the effectiveness of TGCT. We know that it has shown to reduce PTSD, depression, and maladaptive grief in the aftermath of disasters. And we also know that it improves school behavior. So importantly, we see enhanced classroom rule compliance, enhanced positive peer relationships, an increase in school interest, and a decrease in school anxiety and withdrawal. And the one that I left out there was also better grades, which is obviously important to school personnel. And so when we're thinking about conducting TGCT, we always start with the pre-treatment assessment. And a number of people have asked me to talk a little bit about what that assessment looks like. So what we do to start is we really use evidence-based assessment, which accounts for the prevalence rates of specific symptoms within our target population. And because we're a trauma and grief center, we're more specialized and we see, primarily traumatized or bereaved youth. So what we know is that within that population, what we're most likely to see from epidemiological studies are trauma and PTSD, bereavement and grief. So the PCBD checklist is something that we use to assess grief. Depression, the short mood and feelings questionnaire, kids love it because it's actually very short. So it's only about 11 items, but we've been using that. And suicidal ideation, we use a suicidal ideation questionnaire. Functioning, we use the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. And what we do with this data and information is that we are able to determine which modules to use based on the results of this. So for example, if a child or adolescent is elevated in terms of their PTSD, we would obviously use Module 2. If they're elevated with regard to maladaptive grief, we would use Module 3. And we also can determine which practice elements to use from specific modules. So for example, with the grief module, we have specific illustrations that target different dimensions of grief. And again, what we find is that, Module 2 is really designed to reduce PTSD, and that's exactly what we find, whereas Module 3 is designed to reduce maladaptive grief, and that's what we find when that module is given. And what's nice about the modular structure is that you can do Modules 1 and 4, Modules 2 and 3, just Module 2. It's really very assessment-driven and dependent on what that child needs or what that group of children need. So I want to talk a little bit about the intervention objectives for each module. So Module 1, again, is increasing and restoring the capacities for emotional and behavioral regulation. We address maladaptive coping, so coping with trauma or loss reminders, how to predict how they might react in different situations based on their knowledge of their own trauma and loss reminders, and any secondary adversities they've experienced. Helping them to reduce or replace maladaptive cognitions, and providing social support recruitment skills. And this is one of the most important things within Module 1, we believe, that is very helpful, because many of these kids don't really know how to get the kind of support they need and how to ask for that. So that's something that we teach them in Module 1. Again, in Module 1, we talk about, we do a lot of psychoeducation around what is PTSD, what does PTSD look like. This is just one of the handouts that we use, but we have different illustrations that depict different symptoms within PTSD. So children or adolescents, we've adapted this for children in our own clinic, but it's designed for adolescents, can check off what symptoms they're feeling, and then what's really helpful and normalizing is to hear the other kids in the group talking about those same reactions. And again, we also help them to identify their own personal trauma reminders. So we help them to think carefully about what are the trauma reminders outside of them and what are the trauma reminders inside of them, and what are those that are what are the ones that they're encountering on a regular basis. With Module 2, we begin the trauma processing, and this is helping them to increase their capacity to tolerate and regulate their reactivity to trauma reminders, increasing their insight into the origin and personal meaning of trauma reminders, reducing the intensity and frequency of intrusive and distressing thoughts and images from the traumatic event, helping them to identify and restructure hurtful thoughts related to the traumatic experience, and to help them develop a trauma vocabulary for communicating about the meaning and impact of the traumatic experience. Oftentimes kids don't even know how to begin talking about what happened, especially if it was something very traumatic and their friends are asking them, what do I do? Or their friends are asking them, what happened, and the adolescent is thinking, what do I say? What do I do? Oftentimes it helps to create that narrative with them and help them to explain what happened in a way that feels comfortable. For Module 3, we provide psychoeducation regarding loss reminders, grief reactions, and consequences. We also talk about strong emotions in the aftermath of a death, such as anger, shame, or guilt. We address potentially ambivalent feelings regarding the deceased, and we see this quite frequently in some of the juvenile justice population that we've been working with, where the person who died may have actually been a perpetrator of abuse, and so how do you grapple with those feelings? Explore ways to carry on a positive legacy of the person who died. So what are the positive traits or behaviors of the person who died that you can sort of carry with you as a personal legacy? How to reminisce and find healthy ways of connecting to the deceased. And then finally, planning for difficult days and transitions that might be coming up in the future that may be triggering for them. And then finally, preparing for the future is what we do with Module 4. And again, we're thinking about how to help them plan for difficult situations that may come up for them in the future, help them to resume interrupted or delayed activities that have been interrupted because of the trauma or the death, how to promote effective problem solving, how to promote active citizenship. So this includes leadership, advocacy, peer mentorship. We see this quite frequently with many of our bereaved kids, where they decide that they want to work at a bereavement camp, for example, or serve as a mentor to another child who experienced something similar, and that seems to be very beneficial. And how to consolidate skills and knowledge and harness them to launch them onto a positive developmental trajectory. So I want to talk very briefly in the next minute or two about our Harvey Resiliency and Recovery program. And the reason we called it the Resiliency and Recovery program is because resiliency really refers to rebounding or springing back, whereas recovery refers to returning to a former or even better condition. And what we're trying to do with this program is to help families to not only bounce back after Harvey, but come away from the experience with meaningful gains that will hopefully continue to provide them with optimal health over the longer term. So our goals are to disseminate hurricane-related resources regarding how to meet children's mental health needs, and this includes for caregivers, teachers, and providers, to distribute screening tools to use across Texas Children's Hospital, as well as community clinics, schools, and organizations to conduct situation analyses or a needs assessment. And we're hoping that at some point to be able to distribute those to other states where they're needing that type of assessment or screening tool. provide trauma and bereavement-informed assessment competency trainings, and that's something that we're doing across Texas and actually across our network of sites through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Provide multi-tiered trainings for immediate and longer-term mental health care using implementation science. And I'm highlighting longer-term mental health care for a reason, which I'll get to in a minute. And also provide ongoing in-house evidence-based assessment and intervention, again, through our Trauma and Grief Center. So what are some of the implications of what we've learned through previous hurricanes or disasters? We now have a good understanding of exposure-related risk factors, what those are, and we can now do a situation analysis in the immediate aftermath of a disaster that can guide preventive intervention efforts. So really assessing what are those exposure factors that kids have experienced and how to determine which kids have had the highest level of exposure can really help us to target our resources appropriately. What they've also found in studies post-Katrina is that half of 4th through 12th graders exceeded the cutoff for a mental health referral in the year following the hurricane, and 42% actually met the cutoff 1 year later. So they continued to demonstrate those problems, 2 years post-Katrina. So what we really need to understand is that even though federal dollars are designed to meet immediate needs of the population in crisis, mental health needs post-disaster are much longer term, and that's something that we're really working toward and advocating for within Texas. And schools allow ready access to youth who may be unable to receive intervention elsewhere, and so that's why we're also really targeting schools and school-based clinicians to be able to provide those types of interventions, especially to those kids who are underserved and may not have the ability to receive treatment elsewhere. I want to acknowledge our entire team of collaborators, including those at our TAG Center and outside of our TAG Center, as well as a special thank you to our youth and families where we're learning all of this important information. And here is my contact information, and I believe that's also in one of the handouts you'll be receiving. And then finally, here is the code for the CEUs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keploff, for your excellent presentation. We are now going to begin answering the questions that have been submitted during today's presentation. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions to the chat panel in your attendee control panel. Dr. Keploff, one question that has come up. When a child is grappling with both PTSD and grief, which do you start with? Which one do you usually address first?
That's a great question. And, often people will talk about the importance of starting with the trauma or the PTSD, because sometimes kids can't even begin to process the grief until they've had the ability to kind of restore a positive image of the deceased person, and really process the traumatic aspects. But what we also find is the opposite, that kids really don't want to talk about the who, what, why, when, where of the situation surrounding the death until they can really better convey how much they miss the person and what that person meant to them. So I would say that it's very child dependent, that we really try to determine, how high is their PTSD? Do we really have to start with that? Or is it more important at this point to begin to at least start to address the separation distress so that they feel validated and that we really want to learn more about who it was that died and what they meant to them. So again, I think that it really varies depending on the child.
Thank you very much. There's another question that has to do with Harvey, Resiliency and Recovery. You were mentioning that your group is working on the mental health needs post-disaster that are long-term. Could you share a couple of the experiences you've been having with that and perhaps some tips for others facing such a situation, how they could conduct effective advocacy for mental health needs long-term?
Sure, and it's sort of an ongoing process right now because of course we're still in the immediate aftermath of Harvey. So what we've actually done, and this has been in partnership with Mental Health America and UNICEF and Save the Children, is we have actually reached out to a number of funding agencies, foundations that are often local, but really explaining to them and educating them about the mental health needs of kids and the fact that they will require a longer-term effort. And in fact, we were able to successfully advocate for that with one of the funding agencies to let them know that, you know, even though it's wonderful that there's this influx of funds right now, what can we do over the longer term to be able to address those longer term mental health needs? And they have agreed to provide longer term grants at this point. So I think being able to reach out, certainly what I think helped was having partners, so community partners that could also speak to the needs of the kids. But this is something that we're doing through our own, you know, phone calls, letters, and also, you know, editorials in local newspapers to be able to really help educate the public about the fact that this is going to be a long-term effort with regard to children's mental health.
Thank you so much. In this respect, there's another question that relates to this, what you were saying about the schools. You were mentioning that the schools, you were supporting the schools, that a lot of youth is there needing help. What are some of the different ways in which you are supporting the schools to reach out to the youth and possibly families?
Sure. So one of the ways that we've done that is we've distributed a couple of our screening tools that have allowed them to identify those kids that have experienced the highest levels of exposure. And I'm happy to, if anyone wants to reach out to me about what those tools look like. One of them is one that we established for research purposes, which is a Harvey-related, well, hurricane-related exposure and adversity tool that we've given to the schools here. That way they've been able to do more of a situation analysis. We've also helped them to better understand what post-traumatic stress looks like and when to start assessing for that. So one of the concerns of all the school personnel was, you know, what if these kids have PTSD? How will I know? And oftentimes they were looking for that a little too soon. So again, within that first month of the hurricane, every child is on edge. Every child is experiencing some form of anxiety. So helping to educate the teachers about what to look for over time has been a big first step toward that. And then finally, we've done a lot of trainings with school-based clinicians. Again, in partnership with Mental Health America and Save the Children, we recently did a training of actually school-based and community clinicians who are now being deployed out to different schools to conduct trauma and grief component therapy or journey of hope in the schools that were hardest hit by Harvey. So again, you know, really helping to educate those clinicians that are able to help in the schools and getting them out to the schools that need them the most.
Thank you very much. I think there's another question that relates to the assessment. You were sharing your impressive trauma and grief component therapy that's made up of 4 modules, and you were mentioning that I think it must be in module 1, providing social support, recruitment skills for youth. How has been your experience in doing this?
I'm sorry, what was the last part of the question?
Yes, what has been your experience in providing social support, recruitment skills to the youth you have been working with? How successful has this been?
Oh, yeah, I would say that it's been very successful. I think that, you know, what we really do is we break it down for them in terms of how to know who to ask for what kind of support and when. And again, this doesn't have to be with their peers. It can be how to know, you know, who you need to ask for, you know, emotional support, who you need to ask for if you just want to have fun, who do you ask if you need sort of logistical aspects taken care of, and really helping them to identify who those people are, the different social support sectors that they have, and then how to ask for that support in a way that doesn't feel threatening to them, and also allows the person to, you know, have the option to opt out if they need to. So I would say that that's actually one of the more successful practice elements of Module 1, and kids really seem to like it and greatly benefit from it.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kaplow. It is now 1 o'clock. I would like to thank you and the participants for attending today's webinar, and everybody will receive a follow-up email within 48 hours that includes a link to the webinar evaluation and as well as a link to the recording of the webinar. And please do share your thoughts even if you're not requesting CE. I also would like to share that if you're not yet an ADAA member, please consider becoming one. ADAA offers an excellent members benefits such as year-long access to continuing education, free access to special interest groups, including peer online consultation groups, significant discount to ADA's annual 4-day conference coming up this April, promotion of your practice in ADA's online Find a Therapist database, and much more. We hope you will join us at the Anxiety and Depression Conference 2018 in Washington, D.C., taking place April 5 to 8. And on behalf of ADAA and our presenters, thank you very much for joining us today and have a great rest of the day.